I know there's some hoes in this house because Richard Speck paid the Gangster Disciples street gang for protection in Stateville prison with some wet-ass bussy. On the night of July 13, 1966, Richard Speck broke into a Southeast Side dormitory and killed 8 student nurses in a murder spree that is still considered one of the most heinous and horrible in Chicago history. 3 decades after the crime, and even 5 years after his own death, Speck was still making headlines and drawing ire from prosecutors and victims' families who saw him mocking the justice system. In May 1996, reporter Bill Curtis received an 8-year-old videotape from an attorney that was never identified. The tape showed Speck and 2 other inmates in their cell at Stateville prison. Not only did Speck remorselessly admit to the murders and describe how he carried them out in chilling detail, but he engaged in a hedonistic romp of sex and drug use right there in his cell at Stateville prison. This tape sparked outrage among lawmakers in Springfield, who demanded change in the state prison system, holding hearings in the State House, even as the series of reports, Richard Speck Speaks, was still on the air. The Richard Speck Chicago came to know in July 1966 was the very face of evil. On videotape 22 years later, the face of evil had aged, and his hair was dyed blonde. The grainy video was made secretly inside prison walls and smuggled out in 1988, 3 years before Speck's death. It was never learned why the killer made the tape, but it did indicate one thing: the years behind bars taught him nothing. There was no remorse for the crime many believe started the modern era of mass murder. Speck's remorseless admission to the brutal murders of 8 young women made the jailhouse videotape shocking enough. But as for the rest of the tape, to call its contents outrageous was an understatement to many. On the videotape, when he was not talking about the crime, Speck was seen having what amounted to a party with his new black friends among the inmate population at Joliet's Stateville prison. In the final years of his life, Speck appeared to be having the time of his life behind bars, and he was quite proud of it. Or was he? At one point during the video, one of Richard Speck's homie lover friends told him to take off his clothes to show off his blue silk panties and hormonally produced boobs. At another point in the video, Richard Speck is seen counting out money and passing it out to his pimp. Oops, I meant his homie lover friend. If they only knew how much fun I was having, Speck said, they would turn me loose. The reality is, Richard Speck probably wasn't having much fun being a prison bitch, but he had to survive using his wet-ass bussy. So, who made the tape, and why? Most observers believe that members of the Gangster Disciples filmed Richard Speck's sex tape in order to extort prison officials, but their plan backfired miserably.
The release of the Speck sex video to the press in May 1996, showing the super freak serial killer doing some super freaky shit, couldn't have come out at a worse time for the GDs. Larry Hoover, and other top Gangster Disciple leaders, were facing trial fighting for their lives. According to an article originally published in the Chicago Tribune on February 16, 1996, in a secretly recorded tape played Thursday in federal court, Gangster Disciple leader Larry Hoover bragged about the freedom he enjoyed at a maximum security state prison, including conjugal visits, and receiving 30-pound shipments of marijuana. Hoover said on the tape that one of his top lieutenants could corrupt anybody at the Stateville Correctional Center near Joliet, and claimed the gang paid bribes to have keys made for every door in that penitentiary, except the doors to leave. For $100 at a time, one prison staffer let the gang use a key-making machine, and we'd be making keys in 2 minutes, said Hoover, who then made a buzzing sound to imitate the machine, according to tape transcripts. Hoover's boasting occurred on December 11, 1993, as he met privately with gang member John Baugh in the visitors area of Vienna Correctional Center, where Hoover was incarcerated for a murder conviction. Baugh whistled in reaction. "Man, it seems like you," Baugh said, breaking into laughter, "was on the street. Them chumps wasn't living half as good as we was, they was living like paupers," Hoover said. The tapes were played at the federal narcotics conspiracy trial of 8 alleged Gangster Disciples leaders and associates. The defendants include a girlfriend of a top gang leader, who was a Chicago police officer until she was indicted last year. Hoover is scheduled to go to trial in October on similar charges. At another point in the tape where the reception was somewhat fuzzy, Hoover is heard to say, "To go up to the hospital to unit on the 3rd floor, be up there me and smoking for 2 hours. Laying there with my broad, laughing. Referring to the control wielded within the walls of Stateville by a top lieutenant he identified only as Fatty, Hoover said, that was his joint. I ran it in name. He actually ran it. Wasn't nothing that motherfucker couldn't get, Hoover said of Fatty, later identified by sources as Melvin Hayward, who is still incarcerated. He could corrupt anybody. When contacted after the trial recessed for the day, Nick Howell, a spokesman for the Illinois Department of Corrections, labeled the comments as idle braggadocio by Hoover, in order to exalt himself with a fellow gang member. The allegations have been investigated, Howell said, and there was nothing we could definitively pin on anybody. Law enforcement officials say Hoover has maintained his control over the Gangster Disciples, even though his imprisonment on the murder conviction dates back more than 20 years. Howell said, Hoover served some of that time at Stateville, about a decade ago. I'm about to reveal the craziest shit that Richard Speck said on his super freaky sex tape, but before I do, please smash that like button and subscribe to the Cartoon News Network. Wow. The shit he said was crazy, but the Richard Speck sex tape shows crazier shit like him giving oral sex to an inmate, snorting lines of cocaine with the man, and then handing him a few $100 bills. So, Richard Speck surrendered his bussy for protection. He claimed he was having the time of his life, but it looked like a living nightmare. The GDs thought it was a good idea to make the video, in order to maintain leverage over prison officials, but was it worth it? When I called the cameraman to ask him, what the fuck was he thinking, while videotaping Richard Speck giving sloppy toppy to a man and getting his bussy busted wide open? I was shocked and horrified when he said this. After the release of the Richard Speck sex tape, the Illinois state legislature held hearings, and prison officials cracked down on the privileges enjoyed by the leaders of the Gangster Disciples and other gangs. According to a Chicago Tribune article, originally published on November 10, 1996, the Gangster Disciples Larry Hoover lived for many years in the minimum security Vienna prison, where he walked around in an alpaca sweater, neatly pressed trousers, argyle socks, and $300 alligator skin loafers. He too was considered a model prisoner. Though in state prisons for more than 2 decades, Hoover's power and reputation continued to grow. The profits kept rolling into his operations too, according to federal prosecutors. Hoover, a convicted murderer, currently is awaiting trial in federal court on drug trafficking charges stemming from his prison years. Larry's very much feared, said Michael Heltzley, a former prison investigator for corrections, who like many prison experts believe, Hoover helped start the 1978 Pontiac uprising that left 3 guards dead. He can pick up the phone and make one collect call and 4 or 5 major institutions would burn down. They have always played, let's make a deal with him. Stateville guards and inmates say that, until recently, Robert Bigelow, a high-ranking disciple, sauntered wherever he wanted in the prison to conduct gang business, often toting a leather-bound briefcase, and escorted by a handful of beefy inmates as bodyguards. Bigelow had his own cook, said Stateville Captain Glenn Malone. He controlled 2 cells, one where he lived, and one where he kept all his supplies like canned goods, meats, and bread. Also at Stateville, Ernest Smokey Wilson encountered few impediments to running a gangster disciple drug operation back in Chicago, at the Cabrini Green Public Housing Complex, law enforcement and gang sources said. At the same time, he was able to accumulate an astounding cache of contraband and convenience items in his cell. In a series of raids in 1992, officials confiscated dozens of items from Wilson's cell, according to prison investigative reports obtained by the Tribune. Each time the loot was hauled away from Wilson's cell, some of the items, including a cellular telephone, trickled back, according to the reports and Stateville employees. On September 15, 1992, officers raided Wilson's cell and, among other items, found 4 cellular telephone batteries, 13 bottles of designer cologne, a Casio mini-color television, a calculator, an electric iron, and 2 hot pots. 5 more raids over the next month showed that Wilson had ready access to whatever he needed. One officer told prison investigators that he had twice confiscated a portable washing machine from Wilson. Several Stateville employees told investigators they suspected colleagues had helped Wilson get some of the contraband items found in his cell. Those items could have been transported in a briefcase or bag. But how did he get something as large as the portable washer? No one seems to know, though it surely is testimony to his incredible connections behind bars.
Some of the perks gangs have enjoyed are outrageous, some are absurd, and then there are those that are a little of both. Last year, Stateville officials found hundreds of pounds of food, apparently stolen by members of the Gangster Disciples from the prison kitchen and dining hall. The food, which included hamburger meat, huge rolls of sliced turkey, countless canned hams, and boxes of frozen seafood, was used by Lowe to run a thriving cell house restaurant business, prison officials and inmates say. The Gangster Disciples food outlet was perhaps the largest at Stateville, but it had plenty of competition from other gangs and inmate entrepreneurs hawking everything from burritos to fried chicken to macaronis and cheese, all from ingredients stolen from the prison. At times, it reminded me of Maxwell Street, said a Stateville inmate who has been in prison since 1978 and worked as a cell house chef for the Gangster Disciples. I've seen guys with 20 or 30 cheeseburgers walking up and down the gallery shouting, "I've got cheeseburgers. I've got cheeseburgers." Or, "Chicken. Chicken. Chicken." Unfortunately, for the leaders of the Gangster Disciples and other street gangs, there was a huge crackdown on their illicit activities after the release of the sex tape showing Richard Speck using his neck, back, and wet ass, Bussy, to survive in Stateville prison. Point and shoot, take us out of here.
My back, lick my bussy and my crack. My neck, my back, lick this bussy and my crack. First you gotta put your neck into it. Don't stop, just do it, do it. Then you roll your tongue from the crack back to the front of you. Suck it up till a shaking come. Make sure I keep busting up all over my face and stuff.